So welcome, students. I'm proud to announce that I'm going to be speaking about clinical research considerations and definitions. My name is Dr. Lori Shaker Irwin, and I'm happy to be here with you today. Okay, so let's take one moment out and do a 1-minute write. What do you take away from this advertisement? Right from the point of view of a college student passing by this advertisement that you find on the wall. So as you can see, there are a number of people who are behind each new research medicine. There are the volunteers who take part in clinical research studies. They are very important. They are the heroes behind clinical research that allows medical advancements to move forward. There are a number of agencies that are relevant to the clinical research development process and to the heroes that are involved in clinical research as participants. There is the Department of Health and Human Services. CISSCRIP is a nonprofit organization from the standpoint of clinical trial participants. And then there's the FDA, which is so important in the research development and drug development process. Why is research and development important? Because it contributes to scientific and medical knowledge. It helps us to improve care of patients with particular diseases or conditions. It provides information on safety, on particular drugs or devices that we are using, provides the opportunity to develop better medications for the future, and complements our disease prevention strategies. Once we know about treatments that are relevant for a particular disease, we can create prevention strategies that complement that. What exactly is research? The definition of research is that research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And the goals of clinical research are even more so. It helps to prevent disease, to help us to diagnose illness early, to treat disease effectively, to help us cut healthcare costs when we know what drug is right for each patient in their course of the disease. Clinical research efficiently helps us to answer the medical questions and then also helps us to compare one drug to another, called comparative effectiveness research, matching the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. And we'll speak further about that in the course of this talk. At the national level, there's an institute called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, also known as PRCORI, that funds research looking at comparisons of medicines that are currently on the market or potentially soon to be on the market to see which one would be more effective for treating patients. The goal of this research, as part of the Healthcare Reform Act, is to make sure that we are treating patients with the best medicines and treatments possible to save in healthcare costs. Here's a review question for you. Take the time out. What is the systematic investigation method that is used to conduct research? Let's go over the answer together. Systematic investigation requires use of the scientific method, which includes making your observations, formulating a hypothesis, designing an experiment to test that hypothesis, gathering the data and analyzing it, and making conclusions based upon the experimental data. So as we move forward in my talk on clinical research, I want you to think about the scientific investigation that might be appropriate for testing new medicines in DMD. And we will have some further comments on that later on in this talk. So now I'd like to talk to you about some considerations when conducting clinical research. There are a number of stakeholders involved in the clinical research process, and taking all those stakeholders into consideration is very important. The patients, the scientists, the investigators, the federal government, the public, and the lay people who are interested in the outcomes of clinical research. Remember who's paying for the clinical research. It's usually the taxpayers' money that goes towards a lot of funded clinical research. So let's just start out with legislation, which is with regard to the government making appropriations of funding to conduct clinical research. Funding is important because it comes from different sources, and we need to know the sources and the conflicts of interest that those sources may have in the conduct of clinical research. We also have to consider the ethics of clinical research, making sure that the patients are taken care of, that their safety and welfare is of utmost importance, and also to make sure that the clinical practices and the best practices for clinical research are carried out with study documentation having higher integrity and being able to answer the research question once the data are analyzed. So let's start out with legislation. The Clinical Research Enhancement Act of 1999 appropriated a large amount of money towards the clinical research process. And there is the Clinical Research Act of 2004 that supplemented that. We had recently some California stem cell legislation that allowed for taxpayer money to be used for stem cell research for a number of different diseases. Here at UCLA, we were awarded a Clinical and Translational Science Award along with 60 other institutions across the country who are academic medical centers conducting a large amount of clinical research in their medical centers and with their patient populations. And most recently, here in 2015, we have additional regulations with regard to clinical research that is streamlining it as much as possible based upon past regulations that have sometimes hindered clinical research and its progression through the timeline. Funding for clinical research comes from a number of sources. The federal government is one of the most significant funders of clinical research through the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health, also known as NIH, has multiple centers back east that prioritize research in significant areas. For instance, allergy and infectious disease, children's and maternal health, mental health issues and drug abuse. And so these 20 centers are able to fund research for both basic scientists and clinical research. Another significant source of funding is our pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. Those companies fund clinical trials, also called industry-sponsored studies, and these are significant because their vested interest is in making sure that their drug is developed and eventually brought to the pharmacy shelves. Patient advocacy organizations are an important source of research funding as well. For instance, the Muscular Dystrophy Association may be sponsoring research in that therapeutic area, which is an important source of revenue for some scientists who are just pilot testing new agents to treat the disease. Medical and professional societies are also a source of revenue or funding for clinical research studies, and we see this groups of physicians who may be interested in offering opportunities to young investigators to conduct clinical research in specific areas. And we also have private foundations who may be interested in funding clinical research. So there are a number of sources for funding clinical research, and since clinical research is so expensive to carry out, it's important that we recognize these funding sources. Ethics. From the ethics perspective, the primary goal of clinical research is to balance medical progress with subject safety, because we don't want to move too quickly forward and put subjects at risk who might not otherwise be at risk if they didn't participate in the clinical trial or take the particular drug under study. Ethics and legislation. In terms of protection of research subjects, there are a number of ways in which we protect research subjects. First of all, there is the IRB. The IRB is an ethics board that reviews clinical trials to be conducted at academic institutions. So here at UCLA, we have 5 IRBs. And each of those IRBs is tasked with reviewing the research from particular therapeutic areas or particular divisions on the campus. So for instance, we have 3 medical IRBs, 1 upper campus general IRB that reviews the research from the departments of psychology or from the business school, and then we have South Campus general IRB that would review health services research and patient medical record research that might be going on. So these IRBs are important because they have the oversight for all the research being conducted at an institution. And here at UCLA, those 5 IRBs are responsible for about 3,000 research studies. Another way we protect research subjects is through data and safety monitoring boards, also known as DSMBs. Data and safety monitoring boards are groups of people who review clinical research studies on a regular basis to ensure that the patients remain safe who are participating in the clinical trials, and also that the study will eventually answer the research question that it is intended to answer. So the composition of particular data and safety monitoring boards might be experts in that area of research. For instance, in DMD, we might have DMD experts. We might have ethicists who could help us with resolving recruitment issues and inclusion-exclusion criteria of who might participate in a study. We would have statisticians who would help us to make sure that we have enough patients to answer the research question. And these people, as a collective group, have a consensus about the outcome of a study and whether or not to continue to move forward. So they have the ability to stop a study for safety, if there's problems with safety of research subjects on that study. They could possibly stop the study because of efficacy, where one drug on a particular arm of a study is better than another arm on that particular study. They could stop it for quality. If the quality of the data is so poor that we're not going to be able to answer the research question, then they can stop the study for quality. And the last one is futility. If, because we don't have enough patients or enough data to complete this study, then we can stop the study from a futility standpoint. So these data and safety monitoring boards have become very important over the years, and they were especially important when I was doing my HIV research, because many of the activists, the HIV activists, would want to know what the decisions of the data and safety monitoring boards were with regard to efficacious HIV agents. And so we see that activism now in DMD, we see it in breast cancer, we see it in a number of therapeutic areas where people are very interested in the decision-making processes of data and safety monitoring boards. The informed consent process, also known for short as IC, is a process by which the investigator speaks to a potential research subject about participation. And what's really important here is that the potential participant receives as much information as possible about the research and knows the purpose of the research, what's going to be required as part of the research, what interventions they're going to receive, what to do if there's problems. So it's an ongoing discussion between the investigator and the research subject. And you may have seen throughout my talk that I've been interplaying between subject and research and participant. And often that is the case. The ideal term when someone's participating in a clinical trial is the research subject or the research participant. And we defer the use of patients to people who are have a particular disease and are patients in a clinical trial at the same time as they're receiving their standard of care treatment for those diseases. So there may be some interplay between those terms, and I just wanted to alert you to that as well. And then the last but not least, the research subject advocate is also an important protector of research subjects. And as I mentioned at the beginning in my biography, I am the research subject advocate here at UCLA, and research subject advocates were placed at academic medical centers all across the country. There were about 150 of us in 2001 when there were 2 tragic deaths that occurred on clinical research studies. And so what the NIH intended to do was to make sure that someone was there at the site of research and to make sure that even though the IRB had approved the research, that the research was actually being carried out the way that the IRB had approved that research. So there are a number of protection areas that are important for making sure we're caring for our research subjects when they're participating in clinical trials. At the federal level, there's some protections and approvals as well. The FDA is responsible for approving all research conducted in human beings using investigational agents. And we'll talk about the FDA review process shortly. The NIH has its own responsibilities, standard operating procedures, data and safety monitoring boards, which also ensures federal protections for research subjects. And then at the federal level, under the Department of Health and Human Services, we have the Office for Human Research Protections, also known as OHRP, that has responsibilities for protecting research subjects at all academic institutions across the country. So with regard to ethics and regulations, when we look historically, the Nuremberg Code in the 1940s defined voluntary consent. At that time, there were a number of Nuremberg trials of doctors who had experimented on human beings who were prisoners, and the prisoners had not voluntarily given consent to participate in the experimentation. And so this was a defining moment for voluntary consent for everyone who participates in clinical research or any type of research for that matter. So voluntary consent, we come back to that informed consent process and the importance of that informed consent process as a discussion between the investigator and the potential research subject. Later on, the Declaration of Helsinki defined how we combine research with clinical care. And this was very important because doctors have as their primary goal is to make sure that patients are treated with the best treatment for their course of illness. And also, when they're serving as a research investigator, they can have a conflict of interest because they might want to have their patient, for whom they're also serving as their primary care provider, also participate in the clinical trial. So this was an important document that related to the issues of combining research and care and teasing out the differences between what is truly research and what might be standard of care for a particular disease. So let's say in cancer, we would like to conduct some magnetic resonance imaging of tumors. And typically, standard of care might be 3 MRIs per year, but in research, we need 5 MRIs per year. So standard of care would be 3 of those 5 MRIs, and 2 of those would be strictly research MRIs. So that's how you would tease out MRIs in cancer research and the standard of care versus strictly research interventions. The Belmont Report is an important document that came out in 1979, and it has a number of important components for which the IRB uses as their basic tenets for approving research at institutions. So we're going to be speaking to that on our next slide in depth, because that is the whole front end of the decision making about whether or not an IRB approved protocol can be moved forward. The Code of Federal Regulations and the Common Rule are other legal requirements for conducting clinical research that outlines the responsibilities of investigators, sponsors, and the informed consent process, making sure that research subjects are protected all along the way. So to tell you a little bit about the Belmont Report and the tenets of the Belmont Report that are important for the IRB to make its decisions. Remember, the IRBs are the ones that make the approvals at academic institutions to allow the research to move forward. IRBs are usually constituted with scientists, people affiliated with the institution, experts in biostatistics or ethics, clergy, lawyers, and community people who make a decision about moving the research forward or changing the research as we find out more about safety and efficacy of the interventions being studied. So some of the important tenets are respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. As far as respect for persons, we want to make sure that everyone who is considering participating in a clinical research study is an autonomous agent, able to make a voluntary decision about participation. And if they're vulnerable, not able to make a decision for themselves, or who are institutionalized and not able to make decisions, they're entitled to specific protections. For the for the muscular dystrophy patients, this would be with regard to children who cannot make decisions for themselves and who have the parents make decisions about participating in a clinical trial. From a beneficence standpoint, we do not want to cause any harm to our research subjects. So we want to maximize the possible benefits and minimize the possible harm. Now, the benefits could accrue to the individual themselves. So for instance, in the muscular dystrophy trials, we would want to make sure that the children are receiving the benefits of the research, if there are benefits to be accrued. And otherwise, if there are no individual benefits, then we want to make sure that society will reap the rewards of the research, because we don't want to put research subjects at risk if we're not going to be able to answer the research question and make sure that we minimize the harm and maximize the benefits. So society could receive the benefits of research, for instance, in vaccine research, where large numbers of the population receive test vaccines before eventually they're given to the community as a whole. Justice is the fairness and distribution of research risks and benefits. So for instance, from my HIV research, if we were to test an HIV vaccine in a country where the prevalence of HIV is very high, we would want to make sure that that same country receives the benefits of the research by being able to have the vaccine available at a reasonable cost to them and distributed widely because of the high prevalence of the disease. So fairness in the distribution of the research risks and benefits is part of the justice. So these are the tenets of the Belmont Report, and these are very important for approval and continuing review of clinical research. So with regard to other ethics and regulations, I'd like to tell you about the International Conference on Harmonization, also known as ICH. ICH developed good clinical practices that are relevant when conducting clinical research internationally. So for instance, if a trial were conducted according to good clinical practices in Japan, that data would be similar to the data collected in the United States under good clinical practices. So that Japanese data could be used in an application to the FDA here in our regulatory authority to advance that drug through the drug development process. So it's international regulations and guidance for which trials being conducted in other countries could be similar to the trials conducted here in the United States. And this helps with pushing a number of drugs forward because the collective information from a number of trials can help provide the foundation for the FDA or other regulatory approvals across the world. HIPAA and confidentiality and privacy is very important in clinical trials. HIPAA is an important authorization. It's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act that made sure that people's medical and health information isn't transferred unless there's a reason for that transfer of information from one entity to another. So for treatment, payment, operations, for instance, at your dentist's office or at your doctor's office, there would be a transfer of information, let's say, to your medical insurer or the like. But for research, the research subject needs to make a special indication that allows for that transfer of information. Medical information, health information, some of the outcomes of the procedures or laboratory tests. And that's important to keep under consideration because part of the informed consent process is to speak to the issues of the trial, but also speak to the issues of privacy related to the data and documentation that's collected as part of the trial. There are a number of conflict of interest rulings that also apply to the ethics of regulations. They're also called COIs, conflicts of interest. And this has to do with making sure that we are transparent about the clinical research process. If someone's receiving money on the side to conduct clinical research, it's important that the research subjects know that. Or if the investigator is speaking on behalf of a pharmaceutical company, that is also important and also becomes part of the informed consent process. So there's been a number of conflict of interest rulings, most recently with regard to the Sunshine Act, where all doctors are listed with their associated pharmaceutical reimbursements for whatever activities they might be doing on behalf of pharmaceutical companies. Clinicaltrials.gov is a registration website where all clinical trials are being registered and also where their results are being posted. And this came about because we wanted better transparency about all the clinical trials that are being conducted around the country and around the world. The public is one of the stakeholders in this, so we don't want to see the squelching of negative results from a pharmaceutical or industry-sponsored trial. So before any subjects are allowed to participate in a research study, that clinical trial needs to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And you can look up a number of studies, and why don't you take this as a lesson to be taken outside of the class, is to look up the MDA studies that might be currently listed on the clinicaltrials.gov and where they are taking place across the country. So to take it one step further about that International Conference on Harmonization and using good clinical practices, I'm going to describe this a little further for you. They're international ethical and scientific quality standards for clinical trials in human subjects. And these are very important because they outline the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved. The investigator, who is pivotal to the recruitment of patients, providing the information to the subjects, providing ongoing information about any alternatives that they have to participation. The Institutional Review Board, the IRB, is also responsible for the continuing approval of research. So they approve it at the front end, and they also approve it down the line after they hear about any adverse events that may have occurred on the study, which would impact safety, or Data and Safety Monitoring Board reports that show more effectiveness of one arm of a study or another. So IRBs have this ongoing review of the risks and benefits of the research and make their determinations based upon that information. The sponsor is also important in the research process because there are certain responsibilities for them, especially with their interactions with the FDA and reporting of adverse experiences on clinical trials. And then there are others as well that are involved, and so these are also part of the good clinical practices documentation. Some of the principles of good clinical practices are that clinical trials must comply with the federal guidelines and the protocols. The rights, safety, again, we cannot hear enough about safety, and the well-being and privacy of the research subject are paramount. And so if we keep that in the foremost of our mind when we're conducting clinical research and we make our decisions knowing that we are ensuring right, safety, well-being, and privacy of research subject, we know we've made the right decision. Quality assurance procedures must be in place for every aspect of the clinical trial. We want to make sure that we are able to answer the research question, because if we're not going to be able to do so, we do not want to place the current subjects at risk or future subjects at risk if the trial is going to turn out to be futile. So let's go to a review question now. What are the requirements for conducting good clinical research? And the answer is that complying with the principles of good clinical practice is very important. GCPs, we've emphasized those enough. Maintaining our regulatory documents, and that's ensuring that we're following all federal, state, and institutional guidelines with regard to conducting clinical research, because there are legal requirements, and sometimes people can be found in violation of the law and can be charged with clinical research crimes such as fraud or errors and omissions. Understanding the informed consent process. We know that that's important because the communication between the investigator and the research subjects is an ongoing process. Good source documentation and data management is very important, because if it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. And as you know from some of your journal entries for your scientific lab classes, etc., we need to record everything that we've done and all the data that's been collected, and we can't miss data or record inaccurate data, so that if we intend to replicate the trial, we're able to do so. And that's very important. Accurate and prompt reporting of adverse events and unanticipated problems. This is important from the standpoint of knowing what the safety profile of the drug under development is. So, in the future, when that drug eventually gets to the pharmacy shelves, we know what the side effects of those drugs are. Technically, during a clinical trial, those side effects are called adverse events. But when it gets to the pharmacy shelves and we look at our package insert that comes with our drugs, and we look under the safety profile and the potential for reactions, we see the adverse event data that was collected throughout the clinical trial process for that drug. And so those are very important data, and they need to be accurate throughout the whole course of the collection of the data for the clinical research trial. This concludes the first part of our presentation, and I hope you received an appreciation of all the stakeholders and the regulations involved with conducting clinical trials. We'll continue in our next segment with further information about the drug development process and other issues related to clinical research.